Glad you're here today. We have been looking forward to doing this sermon series on Moses, and I'll tell you what happened. Several months ago, I was kind of reviewing the story of Moses, and I was struck by how modern the story is. And I'll tell you what prompted that thought on my part. And I thought, Moses is really a person who was running away from God. We're going to pick up the story here in the 3rd chapter of Exodus. And I thought, this is a story about a man who's running away from God. And I thought that in so many ways is our story these days. That's the faith challenge of this generation. So we've got it's just 4 sermons. I want to tell you, it's a long story. I mean, we could preach all year on Moses. As you know, it's a great story. 4 sermons, but it's really going to be about how Moses can teach us powerful insights about our faith journey today. I went to Ben Shamnes, our brilliant media person, and told him my idea, and he created this movie trailer. It's 58 seconds, I think it is. A lot of you have seen it, but we're going to dim the lights and let you see it one more time on the big screen because it kind of captures, I think, what we're trying to do in this sermon series. January 2016 has arrived, and we're going to start with the 3rd chapter of the Old Testament book of Exodus, the first 10 verses. We invite you to follow the reading on the screen. We catch up with Moses. He's been in Egypt, now he's run away. He's on the plain of Midian keeping care of the livestock of his father-in-law. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, but it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why this bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. He cried, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, Here am I. Then God said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is now holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father. Notice in this verse how God is reminding Moses of his heritage, who he is, the great patriarchs of the faith. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago in Philadelphia, during a Veterans of Foreign Wars convention, right in the middle of a big speech, the back doors were open and a man came running down the center aisle, jumped up on the stage, grabbed the microphone from the person who was speaking, and cried into it, Does anyone here know who I am? With desperation in his voice, he said it again, Does anyone here know who I am? He didn't remember who he was. A few hours earlier, he just found himself walking the streets of Philadelphia. He had no ID on him. He had no recollection of who he was. He had gone to the emergency room of a hospital. They checked him out, were unable to identify him, but they diagnosed him. They said, "You're suffering from amnesia." And now he was desperate to discover something about his own identity. I think there could be very few things more disorienting than amnesia, not knowing who you are. If you stop and think about it, what would it be like to not even know what your name is? To not know whether you are married or not? To not know whether you have children or not? To not know what your skills are, what you can do, what your job is? All of those are existentially powerful in helping us to kind of function in life, to move through life with meaning and purpose. And he found himself literally empty of all of this information and desperate to find out who he was. Moses, of course, had always suffered from a bit of an identity crisis. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but the first 2 chapters of Exodus tells us about the birth of Moses. The Egyptians had captured the Hebrews. They were living in Egypt as slaves. And Moses was born to a Hebrew, but he was discovered floating in the river Nile by the daughter of the Pharaoh. She looked upon the child, she loved him, and so she adopted the child and raised him. So it's a really interesting story if you stop and think about it. Here was Moses, born a Hebrew, raised as an Egyptian. Moses belonged to a group of people who were slaves, and yet he grew up with the royal family. You can imagine the kinds of identity crises that brought about for Moses. Am I a Hebrew or am I an Egyptian? Am I a slave, a common peasant person, or am I royalty? One day, Moses, acting in the role of Egyptian royalty, was out walking around and he saw another Egyptian beating one of his Hebrew brothers, and suddenly his Hebrew blood within him boiled. He reached out and struck the man and killed him. And that led to a decision to run for his life. To run for his life. And so we catch up with Moses here on the plain of Midian. He's moved there. He's married. He's taking care of the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. He's really out in the middle of nowhere. He's run away from Egypt. He's run away from the Hebrews. And I would suggest that he has also run away from his faith. He has run away from God. I've said this a couple of times in introducing this series over the last few weeks. I think in a lot of ways, Moses was kind of the original hippie. He's kind of checked out of life. He's out there in the meadow, in the mountain, living it up with no pressure on his life. The original hippie, and maybe the original nun. I suspect that he would say about himself that he was spiritual but not religious. He'd found a way of keeping God at a distance. In fact, you can kind of imagine the Pew Research people, the survey people who do all the research on religion coming along. Okay, Mr. Moses, what is your ethnicity? Well, I'm Hebrew. Well, what church do you belong to? What is your denomination? Well, I really don't have one anymore. Oh, yeah, he's another one of those nuns. Do you believe in God? Sure, I believe in God. Do you pray? Yeah, every now and then. He had developed kind of a cozy relationship. He would leave God alone for the most part as long as God would leave him alone. He'd figured out how to keep God at a distance. And then comes this moment, what we call this burning bush moment, in which God reclaims him. In which God reclaims him. We could interpret this moment as something like this. God saying, Moses, you can run away from Egypt. You can run away from your Hebrew heritage. You can run away from yourself. But you cannot run away from me. And God, in this moment in the burning bush, says, Moses, you belong to me. And of course, he sends him on a journey, spiritual and physical, that will take the rest of his life. Well, I want to talk for just a moment about these burning bush moments because it's a major theme in the Bible. I don't know whether you're aware of that or not, but we find lots of burning bush moments in the Bible. Those moments when somehow a person remembers who they are and gives themselves back to God, or they are somehow claimed by God. God says, you belong to me. So I'll just talk about two or three of them. The wonderful story of King David. You can flip over into the middle of the Old Testament there, the books of Samuel, and you'll find the story of David. David, in some ways, had a lot in common with Moses. When Samuel came to David's father, Jesse, looking for the next king of Israel to be anointed, David's out there in the pasture taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest boy. He's young, naive. And literally, Jesse has to go out there and get him and say, David, come in here. Somebody wants to meet you. And the prophet Samuel looks upon David and says, you will be the future king of Israel. And he was. And he was a great king. He was a great warrior, won many battles. He was a great leader. He organized the state. And he was beloved by his people. Beloved. But during the time that David matured from being a young shepherd boy to being the powerful king of a great nation, he accumulated stuff. He accumulated great wealth. And he accumulated great power. And one day, David was out there on the balcony looking out upon his city, and he looked down and he saw a woman named Bathsheba, and she was lounging on her balcony. And she was beautiful. And David thought about taking her for himself because he could. And he did. And later, when he found out that she had a husband, David didn't much like the idea of having any competition at all for Bathsheba. And so he thought about sending her husband into battle so that he might be killed. And he did. And later came this moment where the priest Nathan came to David. He said, David, I want to tell you a story. He said, there once was a man who had lots and lots of animals. He was a rich man, and he had hundreds of sheep. And there was another man that lived in the same city. He had only one little sheep, but he loved the sheep. He raised it. He loved it like he loved his own children. And one day, the man who had hundreds of sheep had a visitor, and he needed to slaughter a sheep, and he didn't want to take one of his. So he took the one sheep from the man who had only one, and he slaughtered the sheep. He said, what should be done? And David looked at him, and he said, that man deserves to die. And Nathan said, you are the man. It was a painful moment, but it was a burning bush moment for David, in which he was reminded about his own identity, who he was, and to whom he belonged. And his relationship with God in that moment was restored. There's a story in the New Testament, only Luke tells it. A story that many of you know it. It's a story we call the prodigal son or the waiting father. It's about a boy, father who had two sons, and the younger son was very ambitious, and as he was growing up, he started thinking about the fact that he wanted to go off on his own. And so he went to his father and he said, Father, one of these days you're going to die, and your inheritance will be split between my older brother and me, and I wonder if you'd be willing to give me my part now, all of it, so that I can set out on my own. I don't think the father liked the idea very much, but he said, of course I will. And he wrote out a check for half of what he was worth. And this young boy went to what Luke calls the far country. We don't know where it was, but we know where the far country is, don't we? Because most of us have been there at one time or another. The far country. And there in the far country, the young boy spent everything his father had given him. He had a great time. He went to the finest restaurants. He ate the best T-bone steaks. He drank the finest wine. He had the best-looking women. He lived it up for a long, long time. Then one day he reached into his pocket to pay for a drink, and his pocket was empty. And thus began the downward slide of the prodigal son's life until he found himself one day on his knees, eating the same food as the pigs. And it was in that moment, in that utterly painful and humiliating moment, that he remembered who he was. And he remembered his father. And he said, "The hired hands that work for my father eat better than this. I wonder if I could go back to my father." And he picks himself up and he rehearses his speech and he heads home. As he goes down the lane to his father's house, his father is standing on the front porch because that's where his father had been every day since the day he had left, hoping his son would return home. The son comes in, he gets ready to make his speech asking for forgiveness. The father calls the servants. He says, "Put the ring on his finger, put the cloak around his shoulders, kill the fatted calf. My son was gone, he was lost, now he is found." And in that moment, the relationship is restored. It is a burning bush moment in which the boy remembers to whom he belongs. The relationship is restored. There's a man named Saul. Highly educated. He was known as a Pharisee. He'd been persecuting the Christians. He was walking down the road to Damascus one day, and suddenly he was struck to his knees, and he was struck blind, and he heard these words, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And in that moment, Saul learned his own identity. From that moment on, he would be called Paul. St. Paul, we call him. And the relationship with God was begun. Well, there's a reason I'm sharing with you these stories about burning bushes. It's because I think that we are suffering an identity crisis in America. Believe me, I've thought about this for a long time, not a few weeks, a few months, but a few years. We are suffering an identity crisis in America. As Christians, as people of faith, we have learned lots of ways to keep God at a distance. There was a time when we knew precisely who we were, when we had the trappings and the surroundings of civil religion, when almost everybody in America was a person of faith. We had clarity about who we were. I remember growing up in the 1950s, going to Lakewood Elementary School in Dallas, and I knew precisely who I was. I was the descendant of English, Scottish, and German immigrants, and I was a fourth-generation Methodist. And every Sunday, we were in church twice on Sunday, in the morning and at night. My fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Robertson, the brilliant Mrs. Robertson, I don't know what she was, but I know that she was a person of faith. She kept her boundaries. She never told us what church she went to. She never invited any of us to church. I think she was probably a Baptist. But we knew that she was a follower of Christ. There's this young girl in my class, brilliant young girl by the name of Rosaline Ziegler. On Jewish holidays, she would not be in school. And we respected her and loved her for that. She knew precisely who she was. Denise, growing up in the Bronx in New York City, the grandparents from both sides, immigrants from Sicily, Roman Catholic, Italian Roman Catholic. When the weekend got here, they were in the cathedral for Mass. Today, I think we have found lots of ways of keeping God at a distance, and we have, to some extent, forgotten who we are. I'll share with you some of the strategies that I think we use. For instance, we use the strategy, I've done this before, we use the strategy of what I call the sophisticate. The person who says, I used to be a person of faith. I grew up in the church. I believed in God. I followed Jesus. But here lately, I've been doing some reading. For instance, evolution. Evolution is accepted science these days. There's no doubt about evolution in the minds of almost all scientists. I just don't understand how that fits in with the story of Genesis. And not only that, but I've been doing a little light reading in quantum physics. The story of the cosmology, the story, the beginning of the universe. And I don't understand exactly how it all works, but I know that somehow it all, according to scientists, it all happened by chance. Honestly, I'd like to believe, but there's just not room for God in my understanding of the universe. And that's okay, except it just needs to be said, there are a lot of scientists who have forgotten more about quantum physics than you and I have, who will tell you that there are so many questions that are unanswered, and that they happen to believe in God because that's the only answer that makes sense to them. The sophisticate. And then, of course, there's the strategy we've already talked about, the strategy of the nun. The person who says, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Look, I don't mean to really criticize anybody, but I'm going to get us all before this is over. But I am. The person who says, I'm spiritual, but not religious, I just think it's primarily a way of keeping God at a distance, or like Moses, having God on your own terms. Out there, that's the way Moses was. He's out there in the middle of nowhere. He says, I'll pray when I want to. God, you just leave me alone for the most part. I'll leave you alone for the most part. So there's the nun. I'm spiritual but not religious. I don't really feel like I need to commit to any kind of organized religion. I have a pastor friend who says occasionally somebody will say to them, you know, it's not that I don't believe in religion, I just don't believe in organized religion. And he'll say to them, well, that's the only kind there is. That's what Jesus did. He got these 12 guys and he organized them. That's why we're here. So there are the nuns. It's easy to be a nun. You can have God on your own terms. Do you believe in God? Yeah, I believe in God for the most part. Do you pray? I pray every now and then. Not only that, I care about the world. Sometimes I'll go to a website and give some money for digging wells in Africa. Occasionally I'll work in a soup kitchen. But I'm not really willing to make a huge commitment. I want God on my terms, not God's terms. There's a third strategy. I'm going to get a lot of us with this one, including me. It's the strategy of the churchgoer. What we might call the person who is religious but not spiritual. Do you believe in God? Oh yeah, I believe in God. I go to church. No, do you believe in God? Oh yeah, I believe in God. I go to church. I even attend some meetings every now and then. When the plate is passed, I write a check or put some money in. I've even gone on a mission trip. But the problem is that the word God is just an abstraction for me. And so I spend most of my time doing good works. How we have learned to keep God at a distance. And is there any wonder that we feel empty so much of the time? I have a friend that likes to ask this question, and it's a really good question. He'll say, when was the first time that God became more than just a word for you? When was the first time God became more than just a word for you? That's a good question. This is the question I ask. It's a better question. When was the last time God was more than just a word to you? When was the last time that God was more than just an abstraction or a concept or a word for you? When was the last time you went to your knees and said, God, here I am. God, here I am in my pain, in my grief, in my sin, in my emptiness. Remind me that I belong to you. Love me. Forgive me. Send me.